okay, because it means something different to everybody. Continuing with the author here, the author's role in meaning is what we're going to look at and why that's important, realizing that we have two authors of the biblical text at all times. Y'all with me so far?
Yes.
What do I mean by that? We have two authors of every biblical text. What does that mean?
The Holy Spirit, God providing the inspiration.
And
But
then writing it.
it's formed or put forth with the writer's what do you call that, personality.
Absolutely. His intellect and personality. So that the two authors, you have the divine and you have the human author. And there's a confluence there that moves in such a way that what God intends to have written, the human writer writes. We covered that part when we looked at inspiration. Very critical for us to understand. So when we talk about the role of the author's role in meaning, we're not only talking about the human author, we're also talking about the divine author. We're especially talking about the divine author. Okay? Here we go. A. Look for the author's intention as expressed in the text itself. So we just looked at the Matthew passage when we're doing the context piece, right? And we found out that the intention, what was the author's intention there? Not what was the subject, but what was his intention?
To give power to the disciples, apostles,
Okay.
and for them to understand that they have been empowered to go out and now do it to the church, instruct the church, and do what they needed to do to the church.
Okay. You want to try it?
A general plan or blueprint for how the church is to be directed for church discipline.
Yes, for church.
His whole intent was to get them to understand that, guess what? You are being empowered, or you're being given an authority to govern the church at this particular point in time. Once at the point in time when Jesus ascends, that's his intent. But watch this. So, but when we read it, or when I'm saying we in a modern sense,
Yes.
okay, that we never get to that interpretation. We take it to mean whatever tickles our fancy, from casting out demons, binding and loosing, having the power over the devils and stuff, to pray. And that was never the author's intention. His intention was to describe for us 20th century or 21st century readers how Jesus prepared the disciples and gave them the authority, right? But for the immediate culture that he was writing in, and as he was teaching, he was telling the immediate audience and culture, he was telling them know that, listen, when I go, you're going to be the 12 that will have, or the 11 at this point, that will have the authority to govern the church,
Right.
my church, the one that I'm going to build. And again, so that is critical for us to grab hold of all the time. The author's intent must never be jettisoned from the interpretation of it. When we get into application, it's also important that we have we don't jettison it, but then we can make applications based on current events as long as it lines up, and we'll get there once we get into the application part. Here we go. B, supplement the author's role in meaning. Supplement with insights from the author's setting to aid in understanding the text and the expressed intentions. The context of the author's life setting, that is invoked, should be the most probable context. The text is primary and authoritative over any extra biblical insight into intention gleaned from background study. So here, this point here is simply saying that we've got to always keep the author's intention in the forefront. But the way that we come up with the author's intention, we need to go to extra biblical sources, right? And those extra biblical sources, they help to bring the text alive so that we can really get an insight into his historical context. So that as he wrote to that historical context, he's communicating a specific something to the folk, and watch this, and that's his intention. And so any extra biblical insight should not take authority or precedence over what the text actually says. Remembering again, we went through transliteration and then translation, right? Over time through all of this written text. So watch the Holman Study Bible is one not Holman Study Bible, the Holman's Bible Dictionary is one I like, right? And it gives you a lot of historical and cultural information about time periods and things that are in the Bible, whether it's land, whether it's people, whether it's expressions, all of that stuff. It gives you historical and it gives you cultural. And when you read that stuff, and there are other extra biblical sources that you can get to kind of help you understand it, we find some interesting things, and the tendency is to grab those interesting things and run off with them and make them the main thing, as opposed to what the text is. So that's
Sounds good.
It really does. It drives you, gets you excited and all that stuff, but that's not what you're supposed to be teaching or preaching. You're only supposed to use that to help you interpret the text, right? And then it becomes a support for why you are interpreting it the way that you are. Very critical. So again, the context of the author's life setting that is invoked should be the most probable context. Be not drunk with wine, again, is one that I love, okay? In Ephesians, right? And we read that and we say, be not drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. Well, he says, don't do this, but do this. Well, what is that all about? And people will say, well, you're not supposed to be controlled by alcohol. Well, the application is true, right? But remember, that's written to the church. And so he's not really saying don't be drinking wine because it's a sin, like some people kind of go there. But what the author is really doing in that text here is he's really, when we go do the historical and cultural background information on, we find out that Ephesus, the Temple of Diana, the way that they worship, the Ephesians worship Diana was they begin beyond the sexual exploits. They believe that getting drunk or getting inebriated, it was the way to get close to God, right? But Paul is saying, no, don't do that. He said, don't do it like that. He said the way you do it is to be filled with the Spirit every day, right? And so again, that's the historical context. So now when we go back and make interpretation of that text, we get it. We say, you know what? Like a person that needs alcohol every day to be controlled, so they get their courage up or whatever. He said that's not the way. He said, listen, the way is to draw closer to God. If you want to walk in the Spirit, if you want to be obedient to God, if you want to walk in the light continuously, he says, be filled with the Spirit. See that? So again, that whole idea, this is really, really important. But we can't preach, be not drunk with wine, and preach that text again and just make Diana the whole piece, because the whole piece is not teaching Diana. What it's really teaching is how to remain in obedience to God, how to be empowered to walk out what God has called you to walk out in the first place. All right, here we go. Summarize the author's intention or the text's content by means of an intrinsic statement or statement of the text's generic conception, which is a big old mouthful, which equals the author's overall argument. This helps you to verbalize your controlling idea of the whole of the text that have already been formed. In other words, what this is really saying is, once you've done the historical stuff, it says then write out a controlling statement. Right? Intrinsic genre simply means that what is being said, the idea that's in there, right? And we're going to see that in a minute when we go through all the steps at the end of this. But again, the idea is this is how we come to know and determine what the author's intent is, and how we understand the meaning of what he actually wrote, what they actually wrote. All right, text role. Now we're going to go to the text, the Bible itself, or what was written down. Say not what